Good morning, Joe. Welcome back for week number 5 of Journey with Jesus to Jerusalem, and welcome to everybody who's online with us this morning on this beautiful Sunday morning here in Westtown, Pennsylvania. I hope it's beautiful where you are as well too. A couple of announcements real quick before we get going. We've got a lot of stuff to get through this morning. Just want to make sure everybody here is aware and everybody online is aware that we're taking the next 2 Sundays off, so to speak. Oh, I know, you're just crushed. Next Sunday being Palm Sunday. The Mass tends to run a little bit longer because we read the Passion, what we read over the past couple weeks. And then Easter Sunday, we're not going to meet because people with families and this, that, and everything else. So we will pick up again with our last meeting of Journey with Jesus to Jerusalem on the Sunday after Easter, which is Divine Mercy Sunday. But again, that's going to be 3 weeks from today. So again, the next 2 weeks are off. Also, secondly, and it may not have been clear in the announcements in the bulletin, we're going to have to put a new one in, but after we finish Journey with Jesus to Jerusalem, we're going to actually start a second program, and it's less me. You don't have to look at me, which people here are very happy about. Unfortunately, we can't do this one online for copyright reasons and everything else, but what we're doing is watching The Chosen. If you didn't hear that, sister here just get big ooh and ah, so very happy. So for those of you who don't know, it's an 8-part series, and it's a story of Jesus' apostles. And it's kind of a fictional account in the sense of they kind of give a backstory of what could have been going on and everything, but it's very faithful to the Bible. And for those who have seen it, I invite you to come back and see again. This is obviously it's an in-person thing, but what we're going to do for those 8 weeks is watch an episode, and then we can talk about it. And it's a really, really good series. And the new season is coming out. I think the first one is Easter Sunday, correct? The first episode of week 2. So we'll go through and we'll watch season 1, and then you're more than welcome to go to season 2. All right? So that is the deal. All right, so today we are into week 5 of Journey with Jesus to Jerusalem, and we're going to do something a little bit different today. So our focus so far has been Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, and we'll come back to that when we, 3 weeks from today when we meet again. But I always like to say, okay, Jesus' journey is really our journey, right? And we're on a journey as well. And Lent is a time for us to reflect on that. What is the journey of our life? And ultimately, what is the end? All right, what is it that we are journeying towards? I was sitting before Mass this morning. I was reading through some prayers that I kind of read sometimes to get myself ready for Mass. And one of the things I was reading is the things that we should ponder today. And one of them was we have eternity to prepare for, right? And judgment to get ready for. And it's like, ooh, boy, yeah. Don't be behind me in that line. So what I thought I'd do today is in terms of Jesus' journey, our journey, what is it that we're journeying towards? And what we're journeying towards is what happens at our death, and then what happens afterwards. And a question that people always ask is, well, what happens when we die? I mean, that's kind of the eternal question, right? What happens to us when we die? Now the answer is none of us know for sure. I haven't don't think I've come back from the dead and I'm actually going to report what goes on. All right? But what does the church teach happens after we die? So I like to go through, and I'm going to move pretty quickly because there's quite a bit of material. For those of you who have the notes, you can see it's like 4 pages worth of stuff. So we'll move pretty quickly, but then hopefully have some time for some question and answer. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit later as well. So a couple of introductory points before we get started. And this is a couple of things to always keep in mind as we're talking about this. First of all, God and creation. All right? Certainly from our Catholic perspective, who creates everything and maintains it in existence? God does. All right? If God were to simply say, you know what, to heck with these people, what would happen to us? We would just disappear. We would cease to exist. Exactly. Right? The Christian perspective, God creates everything. God maintains our existence simply through His will. And here's a mind-blowing thing. We human beings are created for eternity. In other words, when we were conceived by our parents, right? When God gave us life, when God gave us a soul, there is never again going to be a time that we don't exist. Think about that. Never again is there a time that we do not exist. Whoa! Right? Kind of blow your mind, right? Keep that in mind as we're going through our talk for today. A couple of extremes to avoid when we're talking about, and you'll hear this in the world, and sometimes you'll hear this within the church as well too. Hopefully not the first one, right? But certainly the second one we do. So a couple of extremes to avoid. First is the idea, and there's a lot of this in our society today, that's the atheistic view, that when we die, what happens? Well, we just cease to exist and that's the end of us, all right? What a sad understanding of human, it's like, what's the point, right? The existentialists in France and other places, and it's like, what's the point? If we just cease to exist, what's the point of all this? Obviously, Catholicism does not maintain that perspective. Another perspective, and one that is pretty prevalent in our church and various areas of it, is that, you know what? Everybody's going to be saved. God's not really going to send any. How could God send anybody to hell? Well, God doesn't send anybody to hell, but we'll get to that, all right? But everybody's going to be saved in the end, and that's called universalism, right? The Catholic Church does not hold either of those positions, right? We're in the middle of this, all right? So again, just some things to keep in mind as we move through, all right? So what happens when we die? A little brief outline of what we're going to be talking about this morning. Come on. There we go. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about death, what death is. We'll also talk about, our individual judgment, heaven, hell, and purgatory. And again, we're going to touch on these very quickly. And then finish up or bring everything together talking about the final judgment. All right. So that's our outline or our overview for the day today. All right, so death. What is death? There's a good thing to, beautiful morning, let's talk about death. All right? Well, Jesus died, right? Jesus died, right? And so we will experience what Jesus experienced as well too. So what is death? Death is essentially, from a theological perspective, it's the separation from our body, it's the separation of body and soul. What happens? Well, our body ceases to exist as a physical thing. Now people will say, well, you can't really, the molecules and stuff and the energy and whatnot, they go, whatever, all right? But our bodies, when we die, they will either decay or they will be burned, or, unless any of us here is a saint, there are some people who are incorruptible. And if you come on, again, another blatant plug, if you come on one of my trips, you can see some incorruptible people. But anyway, I'm not going to be that person. All right, so I'm either going to decay or I'm going to be burned, one of the two. All right, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Right, we hear that. Well, sometimes we hear that on Ash Wednesday. That's the point. From ashes we came, to ashes we shall return. From dust we came, to dust we shall return. Oftentimes people have some questions about cremation. We can talk about that a little bit later or afterwards if people have questions about that. But that's oftentimes something that comes up. All right? So body and soul separate. All right? The body ceases to exist as a physical being or physical entity, but our soul does continue to exist. All right? Now what that looks like or what that is, don't ask me. I have no idea what a soul looks like, is, how it exists. We don't know. All right? But we will retain our rationality. We'll retain our free will. We will be rational, free beings, or they should not be, but souls. Again, how that works, I don't know. People ask the question, are people who died, are they aware of what we do on earth? So it's like your grandmother. I could just think of my grandmother. She goes, don't do this, don't do that. I'm like, can my grandmother see all the bad things I do in my life after, I don't know. I have no idea, no clue. All right? But we do believe that our soul continues to live on. A couple of clarifications before getting into what happens with our soul. Different churches, different Christian churches have different understandings of what happens. All right, so we're going to talk today about what the Catholic Church teaches about what happens to us when we die. Many Protestant churches have a different understanding, including, many of them believe that when we die, we go into a sort of deep sleep. We're completely unaware of anything. And it's a sense kind of like a hibernation until the Last Judgment. That's what some Christian churches believe. The Catholic Church does not hold that, right? But some Christian churches do believe that. One thing that no Christian church teaches is reincarnation, right? We have that influence, that Eastern religious influence has come into Western society. And there are people, even some Catholics, who believe that we are going to be, when we die, we're reincarnated into something else. If we lived a good life, we're reincarnated into something greater. If we live a bad life, we're reincarnated into a flea or a stink bug. There you go. A stink bug. Yeah. Or a theology professor, one of the two. It's like, I don't know. All right? Yeah. So, no. All right? From the Catholic, actually the Christian perspective, actually from the Jewish, Islamic, and Christian perspective, right? Catholicism as well. You get one shot. That's it. All right? Right? So no reincarnation. Oh, oops. Transitions are bad again. All right, so what happens when we die? Now, this is from the Catholic perspective. What's going to happen to us? Right? The first thing is upon our death, we are going to experience what's called our particular judgment. Some people will call it individual judgment. We have someone making noise in the back of the room, disturbing us. All right? So what are we going to do at our particular judgment? Well, we're going to meet God. Right? We're going to experience God as God is. Ooh. Sounds really interesting, also sounds kind of scary, especially if you're me. And what we're going to have to do at that meeting is we're going to have to render an account of our life. All right? What's God going to ask us about? I don't know. Right? God's probably going to ask us different things, but some of the things God's probably going to quiz us on, so to speak, our faith. Right? Did you believe in me? How well did you believe? How strongly did you believe in me? How about your love for others or your lack of love? Now again, from the Christian perspective, love is not touchy feeling, huggy, all that other stuff, which is what society says. No, loving another is willing the good of the other. How did you in your life actively will the good of the other? Whoa. How did you use the gifts, the talents, and the abilities that God gave you? God has given each one of us specific gifts, talents, and abilities to be the person who God created us to be. We each have a purpose. How did we use those gifts? Did we use them? Were we like the person in the parable who, took the talents, understood as money there, but invested them in, fivefold or tenfold? Or are we the dope who buried them and didn't use them at all? Right? And the dope who buried them was in big trouble. All right? So how do we use those gifts, talents, and abilities? Our actions. What did we do? What did we not do? It's kind of related to our love for others. What did we do in our lives? What did we not do in our lives? Why did you make the decisions that you did? Right? God's going to ask us about these things. Now, we're lucky here in the Catholic Church. We have the sacrament of reconciliation or confession, so that when we, when we don't live up to what it is we're supposed to be doing, we have a means to atone for that. Right? It's a great gift that God has given to us. Right? But God's going to ask us these questions. And again, as I always say, I think I've said it before, just don't be behind me in the judgment line. All right? Because God's not going to be in a really, really good mood when God gets done with me. All right? And God will judge us at that time. And at that time, 3 options. Right? Option number 1, heaven, hell, or purgatory. One of those 3 things is going to happen. Heaven, hell, or purgatory. All right, so let's go through it and kind of quickly, let's kind of talk about what the 3 things are. I think each of us would probably like heaven. I would. All right, heaven. What is heaven? All right. What is heaven? It's not a cornfield a baseball field in Iowa. All right, for those.
Dyersville's going to hate you.
Actually, have you been to Dyersville? I am. Or for those who don't know, we're referring to the movie Field of Dreams and the baseball field in Iowa. We actually played on the ball diamond. It was actually kind of fun. I thought it was kind of warm and humid, so it really wasn't heaven, but whatever. What is heaven? Right? Heaven can be described or defined in a couple of different ways. The most important is heaven is a place, quote unquote. It's where we are in full communion with God. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it's a state of existence. Let's put it that way. It's a state of existence where we experience God as God truly is. Right? All of our lives, we've been praying to God. We've been, asking God for aid. We've been asking God for mercy. We've been asking God for all sorts of things. But we're going to actually experience God as God is. Whoa, pretty cool. And experience the beatific vision, and you have a definition for that in your notes. The contemplation of God. Right? That's what heaven is. You're in full communion with God. It is a state where you are perfectly purified from all of your sins and from the effects of the sin that you've committed in your life. Right? Cool. Right? I could certainly use that. And again, this is not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. It's meant to be illustrative. Third, heaven is the existence we are incorporated into the Trinity's eternal exchange of love. Whoa, what does that mean? Right? From the Christian perspective, God is Father, Son, and Spirit. One God, Father, Son, and Spirit. Trinity. And what the Trinity is, it's a community of love. Father, Son, and Spirit are in a community of love. The family, by the way, is supposed to be a model. Our human family is supposed to be a model of this Trinity. Is ours? Wait, neither one are paying attention, so I guess. All right? What heaven is, we are incorporated into that. That's the goal of heaven. We are incorporated into the Trinity. Now, there's people say, "Oh, does that make you gods?" No, we're not gods, but we're incorporated into that community, that eternal community of love. There's a great image, and we sort of tend to lose it in church during the offertory. When people they don't come around with the baskets anymore because of COVID, but I guess that'll happen at some point. But do you ever notice when the priest is preparing the gifts for consecration and he gets the chalice and he takes a whole bunch of wine and puts a whole bunch of wine in and then just little drips of water? Do you ever notice that? Do you ever wonder why that is? People always go, "Oh, the priest just wants more wine than water." Well, that's actually an image of this. Right? Because the words the priest says, and I'm just trying to remember, and of course in the heat of the moment I can't remember exactly what the words are, but he says essentially the water and the wine are, we humans come to share in the divinity of Christ who shared our humanity. So the wine is representing divinity, God, and the water is representing our humanity. Our drop of humanity is taken up, is subsumed into the divinity. Right? So there's a great symbolism for all that. And that's what we're talking about here. We're incorporated in heaven. We'll be fully incorporated into God's eternal exchange of love. Well, that's pretty cool. Something to look forward to. Also, heaven is what? It's eternal. I just can't get my mind around that. Right? Something that never ends. Right? Eternity is a very long time. I know it's not time, but that's all we can kind of grasp is it's eternal. Imagine this that never ends. Whoa, that's pretty good. We'll get to questions in a bit. Right? Heaven, in addition to that, you're in full communion with others. And now people may be going, it doesn't sound so good. Well, that's what we've got to clean up in our own lives. Heaven is also a place where we live in community with those who are perfectly incorporated into Christ. Right? That's what heaven is. Right? It's a community of all believers, those who have been fully incorporated into God. Essentially, heaven is a place where who lives? saints, right? And what is a saint? Oh, saint, saint, very quickly, is any person who is in heaven, right? So any person who is in heaven now, any person who ever will be in heaven, that is a saint. A saint, the person who is officially declared by the church, like Saint Simon and Jude, Saint Thomas Aquinas, Saint Augustine. Those are people who the church has definitively declared to be in heaven, all right? So that's why they have that designation here. But are there probably, hopefully, more saints in heaven than those who are specifically designated saints? Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that should be the goal of each of us. Sainthood is our goal. I love this line from Patrick Coffin. I don't know if anybody listens to him or you get his podcast. Sometimes his podcasts are good, sometimes they're not as good. But his tagline or his sign-off line is, be a saint. What else is there? I mean, what a great sign-off line, right? But that's what heaven is, all right? Heaven. Hell. H-E double hockey sticks. All right? We have heaven. Second option for God is hell, right? What is hell? All right? Hell is understood as eternal separation from God. Now I don't know why you got a problem. Oh. There's a big misconception out in the world, and I hear people saying this all the time. I want to go to hell because that's where all my friends are going to be, and we're just going to hang out, we're going to party, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. The famous line from John Milton, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. By the way, Khan used that in The Wrath of Khan for any Star Trek fans out there. A couple people got that. All right? It's a complete misunderstanding of what hell is all about. We'll talk about it a little bit more later, but when people say, well, I want to go to hell because I can party and I can drink and I can do whatever I want, well, what they're talking about is actually, they're referring to goods that God created, but we human beings misuse, right? So if I'm going to party, I want to get drunk every night, because I'm just going to do that in hell. Well, what getting drunk every night is, it's an abuse of something that is good. God created a good, right? Wine is a good, right? You have a glass of wine. Jesus had a glass of wine. Jesus used wine to consecrate his blood, for crying out loud. We're abusing a good. In hell, those goods don't exist. There's no good to abuse in hell, right? It's an existence where goodness is absent, right? So it's just a complete misunderstanding. You're going to rule in hell? What are you going to rule? There's no goodness there. There's nothing to rule. Right? So it's just a complete misunderstanding of what hell is. So complete separation from God. Hell is a state of self-exclusion from God. There's a really, really important point here. Hell really is our choice. Right? Church, does God want everybody to go to hell? Oh, now I'm getting ahead of myself. Hang on a sec. All right? It's a state of self-exclusion, our choice, our choosing to reject God, our choosing to reject God's goodness. What is hell just like heaven? Eternal. Now when I say eternity is a very long time, it takes on a different meaning, right? Hell is eternal, just like heaven, it's eternal, right? As I started to get ahead of myself a little bit, people will say, particularly those who are atheists, will say, what kind of God would send people to hell? And that's kind of the point. God doesn't send us to hell, right? God doesn't will people to go to hell. God's not like, there are, particularly the Calvinist tradition, predestination. God predestines us, God creates us and predestines us either to heaven or hell. Nope. God doesn't predestine us. God actually desires the salvation of every person, right? But as Jesus says in the Gospels, in a couple of different places, the way to heaven, the way to salvation, the gate is very narrow. The gate to the other place, hell, is very, very wide. God doesn't want anybody to go to hell, but God knows it's tough. The journey to heaven is tough. It's very, very tough. right? So what happens? How do we end up in hell? Well, hell can result from a couple of different things, right? Hell results from, first, our quote, and you see there from the Catechism, I'm giving Catechism passages. If you see quotes, the quote is actually coming from the Catechism of the Church. Hell results from a willful turning away from God. What does that mean? Essentially, it's choosing to reject God. This is atheism, right? So for people who are atheists, who claim, there is no God, blah, 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 right? Well, if you deny God's existence, well, this very well could be the end result, eternal separation from God. Also, hell can result from unrepented sin, right? Particularly mortal sin. Now, these distinctions between venial sin, mortal sin, we hardly hear them anymore. I wish, actually at St. Mary's would hear them. But you hardly ever hear them today in Catholic homilies or parishes or anything else, and I think it's a real disservice. Mortal sin, very serious sin that's committed with full knowledge, full consent of the will, and is a serious issue, right? There are, lots of stuff going on in our society today that would constitute mortal sin. But we don't want to talk about, we can't judge people. We talked about that last week, all right? But unrepented sin, particularly mortal sin, and mortal sin here means death of the soul, all right? Sin that results in the death of one's soul, i.e. hell, right? How does one, okay, Joe, can you give us some examples? How do people reject God, particularly through their actions? It's pretty easy to say, well, I don't believe in God, all right? Okay, you get that, all right? But how is it that we reject God in our actions, through our sinful actions? Well, as I mentioned before, all right? God is goodness. Everything God created is good, all right? Goodness is not an attribute of God. Like people say, well, like an attribute of my wife is that she's loving. All right? Goodness is not an attribute of God. God is goodness. God is the source of goodness. God creates everything that is good and gives it to us for our use. But what do? Well, we use our rationality, our capacity to reason. We use our free will, right, to abuse, either to choose the good or to abuse the good. All right? We can use our rationality, we can use our free will to accept what God has given to us and what God has revealed to us and reflect it throughout our lives, or we can choose to reject it. Right? And that's where sin comes in. When we reject the goodness that is God, that's sin. Right? Deuteronomy and Sirach and other places, there's a common theme. God gives us two choices. God gives us two paths. There's the path of life, there's the path of death. There's the path of light, there's the path of darkness. You have to choose. You have to use your rationality and your free will to either accept God or reject God. And when we reject God, again, that is known as sin. So sin results when we reject God's goodness. We use or misuse, as I mentioned before, we use or misuse created goods for some evil purpose, right? Certainly in our culture today, sexuality, right? God created sexuality for a very good purpose, the main one being the propagation of human beings. But what have we done to it, all right? We very grossly misuse the gift of sexuality for other purposes. I always put this up here, and this is a little bit different than in your notes because I moved some things around this morning. Genesis 3, 1-6, that's the famous story of Adam and Eve in the garden. And there's the tree of fruit that God says, don't eat of this fruit. What is that, what does that mean? And I've always understood it in a very personal way. What's the fruit in your life? What is that fruit that you shouldn't partake of, yet we do? I have my fruit, right? But that's what we're talking about here, right? God creates things good, but we use them, we choose to use them for evil purposes. right? Or, what do? We reject what God reveals to us. This is society's really good at both of these, A and B. But we're really, really good at saying, God, yeah, what you reveal in the Bible, what you reveal through your church, I know better, right? And again, this is the sin of Adam and Eve, right? They rejected what God revealed to them, and they said, in fact, this is what the serpent said to them. If you eat the fruit, Eve, guess what? You'll become like gods. You'll know what's right and what's wrong. And that's what we do in our world today. We determine for ourselves what's good and bad, right? We don't listen to what God reveals to us. And think about this in our culture. It's just absolutely rampant. We see it in the secularism, the individualism, the relativism, any of the other isms that we see in our culture today. Right? This is how we reject God, right? Through our actions, through our words. And this is what leads us to HE double hockey sticks. Right? And this is everyone. We're all guilty of this in some way, shape, or form. All right? So God is going to hold us. Going back to our individual judgment or our particular judgment, when we die, God is going to hold us responsible. God's going to say, how did you gifts I gave you? How did you use the goods I gave you in your life? Did you use them for good? Did you use them for evil? Right? How did you do? And God always respects our free will. Right? People always ask, well, if God is so good, how can there be free will? If God is so good, how can there be evil in the world? There's evil in the world because God gives us free will. God knows that the only way that God can be sure that our response to God is true is if God gives us the freedom to reject him. The only way I know that my wife's love for me is true, that she's not going to leave me, is because she's free to leave. Right? Sue could leave I'm surprised she hasn't already, but that's a whole other story. All right? But she is free to just say, see, I'm out of here. And our culture makes it very easy to do that because we got no-fault divorce and this, that, and everything else. But the only way that God can be sure that our response to God is true, right, is authentic, is if God gives us the freedom to say no. And that's what sin is, when we say no. So God respects our free will, gives us what we choose. In a sense, we choose our own salvation or damnation. I'm not saying that it's all up to us, because obviously God does what God does, right? But it's really, our salvation or our damnation in many ways is dependent upon what we choose. Do we choose to have faith in God? Do we choose to live the life that God plans for us? And I love this. When we say the Lord's Prayer, what do we say? We humans say, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. At our judgment, God's going to look at us and say, thy will be done. What you choose, that's where we're going to end up. Right? So heaven, hell. Right? Is there really a heaven? Is there really a hell? I love this quote. And you have it in your notes. There are only two possible answers to these questions, yes or no. We can live as though heaven and hell do not exist, or we can live as though they do. But if we're not quite convinced, it makes much more sense to live as though they do. Think about what is at stake. If we choose to live as though there is a heaven and a hell, and we are wrong, we've lost nothing. At death, it's lights out. Yeah, right? And nobody will ever be able to prove that we were wrong for believing. But if we choose to live as though there is no heaven and hell, and we are wrong, one day we might well find ourselves at the beginning of our eternal destiny, only to realize too late that, by failing to pursue heaven, we have lost it forever. As author Albert Camus has said, I would rather live my life as if there is a God and die to find out there isn't. Actually, you wouldn't die to find out there isn't, because you would just cease to exist and you wouldn't, that's it. You wouldn't know anything. I would rather live my life as if there is a God and die to find out there isn't, than to live my life as if there isn't and die to find out that there is. Right? Great quote. Love that quote. Right? Going from there. All right, so heaven and hell. Third choice I want to talk about, and this is one that fraught with all sorts of discussion and everything else, and a lot of, even Catholics say, does purgatory even exist anymore? Yes, it does. Many of our Protestant brothers and sisters reject purgatory because they say that it's not biblical. It actually is. All right? Now, this is not going to be a treatise on purgatory here. We're just going to talk very, very quickly. But what is the third option, so to speak, for God at our individual judgment? And it is purgatory. So a couple things about purgatory. First thing, purgatory is not permanent. All right? Purgatory is a transitional state. The only two permanents are heaven and hell. Right? So ultimately, everyone is going to spend eternity either in heaven or hell. Right? Purgatory is a transitional or transitory state of existence. Second thing, purgatory is actually a good thing. All right? If God says, you know what, you need some time in purgatory, that's actually a good thing because your salvation is assured. Right? If God says purgatory, guess what? You're gonna be in heaven someday. We don't know when it's gonna be, but your salvation is assured. So purgatory, rah rah, yes. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Think of it as a good thing. What happens in purgatory? Again, nobody knows. I have not been there. I'm not coming back to give you a bird's eye view or anything else. I don't know exactly what happens in purgatory. But I think a lot of people have this understanding of purgatory as punishment. And I'm not sure that's the best way to understand it, although I can see where there would be a punishment, but we'll get there in a sec. All right? Not a punishment, but think of purgatory, the word purge. Right? It's a purgation. Purgatory, it's a purification. It's an existence where we experience purification or a purge from attachment to sin. How many people have gardens? What do you have to purge your garden of? Weeds. Right? Bad weeds come up, right? You got to purge it. And when you purge it, what happens? The other plants grow, right? Kind of the same idea, all right? Purging, right? That's what purgatory is. It's a purging. A purging of what? A purging from our attachment to sin, all right? And a purification that's necessary for heaven. If I want to be in heaven someday, oh, here comes Jerry. If Jerry wants to be in heaven someday, I'm going to pick on him right now because he walks in, or as he hobbles in. I only pick on ordained people, and so if you're not ordained, I won't pick on you. But if we want to someday be in heaven, we have to be free of all of our attachments to sin, right? And that's what purgatory does. It's a way of purging ourselves from all of that. It's also a state of existence, so to speak, where one makes reparation for the temporal effects of one's sins. What does that mean? People will say, well, I thought, I go to confession, God forgives me. Does God forgive? Yeah, God forgives you, but the temporal effects remain. And I always like the example of the broken window. So you tell your kids, don't play baseball in the house. What do? They play baseball in the house, right? They break a window. Right? And they say, oh, I'm sorry, Dad, I broke the window, I'm so sorry. Okay, I forgive you, but now what? I forgive you for breaking the window, but what? Go replace the window. Exactly. Clean it up, go replace the window. That's kind of like the temporal effect for sin. All right? One of the things I do, and my wife and daughter can attest to this, I tend to get a little frustrated, angry at people who frustrate and anger me. And I tend to shoot my mouth off. And do I ever do that, Sue?
No, never.
Never. So there's probably a lot of people who I've ticked off in my life, because of my big fat mouth. Well, I go to confession. I confess that. Does God forgive me? Yes. But there's a lot of people out there who I've ticked off, the temporal effects of my sin. Perhaps, and again, I don't know this, but perhaps part of my very long time in purgatory is going to be to go around to God's going to show me all the people who I've ticked off, particularly the people on the phone, on the airlines, No, I'm just getting mad. God's going to show me all the people who I've ticked off in my life, and I'm going to have to go and make amends to them. Make up for the temporal effects of my actions. I can see that. I can see that. Right? Perhaps that's what purgatory is, or part of what purgatory is making amends for the temporal effects of those. I can't go back. I have no idea who that person is in India who I got mad at because they couldn't fix my ticket on, going somewhere. I have no idea who that person is. But maybe I will in the next life. That may happen. Right? Oh, I think I must have hit something that I didn't understand. So, think of purgatory as a purgation. Think of it as making up for the temporal effects of sin. I'd like to give you just briefly, this is kind of my own personal understanding of purgatory. This is not church. The church doesn't necessarily teach us, but I don't think there's anything heretical or anything wrong. And if it is, somebody tell me. People say this, what do you need purgatory for and all this other stuff? My own personal understanding, right? Kind of going on that example of the call center person who I get mad at. So we've talked about rationality and free will. All right, that's one of the things that makes humans different. We're created in God's image and likeness in part because we have rationality and free will. There's no other creature on earth that has that. All right? My rationality and my free will continue after death. My soul, it'll be a rational, free entity. I don't know if I can call it a being, but an entity. My rationality and my free will continue after death. If heaven, as we've already stated before, if heaven is a place where my free will is perfectly aligned with God's will, in other words, I freely choose the good in all cases. When we die, when we go to heaven or hell, but when we are in heaven, we are still going to be rational, we're still going to be free. Except we're purged, we're cleansed, so that we always freely choose the good. Right? Like Mary. Right? Well, in order for me to get there, my rationality, my will needs to be purged of all those attachments that keep me from fully choosing God. So purgatory, as my understanding of purgatory is that existence that purges my free will of what? Of anything that prevents me from choosing God's will. What are those character flaws in me that prevent me from fully choosing God's will in all cases? What are those things that prevent me from doing that? What can I do? What can I get rid of so that I will always choose the good? That's my understanding of purgatory. Now, could I be wrong? Absolutely. Absolutely, I could be. All right? But if I know I don't know if I know myself, but I know myself well enough to know that I'm not worthy to spend eternity with God in heaven right now. I need some help. I need some cleansing. And if purgatory is the means to do that, if purgatory is the way that God's going to do that, so be it. Is it going to hurt? It might. People who give up smoking and all that other stuff, there's pain involved. I'm going to be like, and knowing me, I'll probably fight it as much as I can because I'm a stubborn Polak. All right? Is that going to hurt? Probably will. But it's for my own good. Anyway. Last thing, just a couple of things really quickly. If you're looking for some references to purgatory in the Bible, there some are. We won't go through them. Also, purgatory in the tradition of the church. I give you a website. I was going to put a link in, but for some reason it wasn't working. But certainly the church fathers spoke about purgatory. Also, Council of Florence and the Council of Trent talked about it in great detail. So just some references for you for that. All right? So let's get back. What happens when we die? Back to our little outline, quick review. So we talked about what death is. We talked about our individual or particular judgment, heaven, hell, purgatory. Last thing, really quick, the general judgment. All right? So God judges each one of us at our individual judgment. If you get to heaven, great. Good for you. Awesome. Hell, not good for you. Purgatory, good for you. Real good in a little while. Then we get to the general judgment. All right? General judgment. This is the end of time. Right? This is the last or the final judgment. All right? And as the Catechism talks about, all will rise, right? So at the end of the world, when will this happen? I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. At the general resurrection, all people will be resurrected, right? Just as Jesus was recommended, all people, bodies and souls come back together again. Our bodies are raised, united with our souls, and we will exist as an eternal, incorruptible being, just as Jesus did, right? For all eternity, heaven or hell. When will all of this happen? Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. On the last day. What is the last day? It's at the end of the world. Churchy term, here's your vocabulary word for the day, the Parousia, right? We're looking forward to the Parousia when Christ returns, right? Christ will return, the general resurrection will happen, we'll all be there, and one last time, God will judge all people. Now, if you're in heaven already, you're not going to get sent to hell. All right, I mean, it's not like that's going to happen, right? But it's just the final resurrection. Christ the King comes, and we have famous passage from Matthew 25, 31 to 46, the sheep and the goats, right? The resurrection. Anybody ever been to the Sistine Chapel in Rome? This doesn't, justice at all. But for those of you who have never been, come on one of my trips, behind the main altar in the Sistine Chapel in Rome, in fact, the Sistine Chapel is where they elect the popes, right? The conclave happens, the cardinal electors. We should have a whole class on that. They go, and that's where they choose the new pope. Behind the altar is this huge, I mean, we're talking, it's probably 50 feet high by 30, 40 feet wide. It's just absolutely huge, and it's the Last Judgment, Michelangelo's Last Judgment. I remember somebody, first time she was ever in Rome, Maria, what were you, 12? She was 12 years old. She saw it and she was scared. But you should be, actually, when you see it. I mean, that was Michelangelo's point. Apparently when, it was all covered up with scaffolding so people couldn't see it, and when they finally took it away and the Pope, whoever the Pope was, went in there, he kind of just went, And that's the point of it. It should scare you, right? The Last Judgment, right? But this is our last things to look forward to. So, on the last day at the end of the world, at the Parousia, Christ judges all, and again, we will exist as resurrected beings, just as Jesus did, either eternally, a very long time, eternally in communion with God, in full communion with God, i.e. heaven, or eternally separated from God, i.e. in hell. Finish up with a trivia question. How many people does the Catholic Church teach are absolutely, positively, 100% in hell right now? I heard an answer. Zero. All right? Answer is zero. Now that doesn't mean that there are not people in hell, but we don't know. We have no idea. No clue at all. Is it possible that Adolf Hitler is in heaven? It's possible. It's possible. Is it possible that, I'm trying to think of somebody really good. Has Mother Teresa been canonized? She has, hasn't she? Yeah, that doesn't work. Trying to think of somebody really good who's not been canonized. But what's that? Dorothy Day. Is it possible that Dorothy Day is in hell? It could be. I hope not, but it's possible. We just don't know. All right? So that's the last thing, quick little wrap up again for people who, particularly people who are watching us online, who have any questions, my name, contact information, phone number, and everything else right there if you have questions. Anybody here? I saw a hand earlier, and I'm sorry for being a little bit rude, but I wanted to, I just wanted to make sure, I knew we were going to run a little bit late, and it's about 11:20 right now, but.
So if we are going to be in eternity for hell or heaven for eternity, that on that end, that's eternal. Have our souls been eternal? Have they always been here?
All right, so the question is, good question. So we're talking about eternity. We're talking about eternity, all right? So we're created as eternal beings in the future. So the question is, have our souls existed in eternity the other way? And as far as I know, the church's answer is no. When we were created, when our parents conceived us, God worked with our parents. I guess that's probably the better way to put it. All right? God worked with our parents when we were conceived, and God granted us an eternal soul. And when that soul is created by God, that's when we come into being. So prior to, well, I was going to say my birthday, but the fact of the matter is, we celebrate birthdays, but we should really celebrate, I know this sounds weird, but Conception Day. Does sound a little weird, but essentially that's what it is. I mean, when we were conceived and when God ensouled us, which begs the question of, does God ensoul us right away? And that's kind of an open-ended question. The basic rule of thumb is, I don't want to say rule of thumb, the basic position is God ensouls us. We believe God ensouls us at conception. But we don't know that. That's a question to ask God, when we meet God. But the church's position is we are created, we come into existence as eternal beings when God created our souls. All right? And this is why human beings, it's so important. Human beings are we're eternal beings. And, this is why things like abortion are such monstrous crimes, because it's a soul. Yeah, it's an eternal soul. And what we're doing and just what our society does. Great question, though. Great question. Anybody else? Anybody else?
What happened to limbo?
Church, and again, big discussions about that. I have to go do a little bit of research on that. But essentially, Catholicism maintains everybody ends up either in heaven or in hell. So what happens to all of those children who, one of my colleagues had a great answer to this one time. What happens to all of those children children who are aborted, children who are miscarried, children who die before they could exercise reason? And over history, there have been a lot. What happens to them? They're in God's providence, certainly. My guess, my answer to that is that they are probably going to be saved, because ultimately everybody ends up in heaven, everybody ends up in hell. And if someone never had the opportunity to live their life and make the decisions that they make, my assumption is, and again, I don't know, my assumption is that they would be accepted into heaven. If there is a limbo, or there's a place where, if it doesn't, it wouldn't be eternal. Right? It wouldn't be eternal. But exactly what happens with all of that, it's a great question to ask. Another beer question for God.
My understanding is that there are many levels of purgatory, and that this is just limbo was one of them. And when Christ died, my understanding is that a lot of the patriarchs were raised up with him.
Yeah. So the comment was, understanding was that there are different levels of purgatory. Now I know maybe some of that came with Dante's understanding of hell, the levels of hell as well too. Yeah. Again, exactly how things work, we don't know. We do believe, but you also mentioned the patriarchs, particularly the Old Testament patriarchs. So Christianity, I believe Christianity as a whole, but certainly Catholicism, maintains that before Christ's death and resurrection, no one could enter heaven. Well, what happened to those in the Old Testament? Abraham and Moses and the righteous people of the Old Testament. I'm sure there are many others as well too. They couldn't go into heaven right away, but they were in a place, I think one of the terms is Sheol or Hades or something like that. They were in an existence, it wasn't heaven, but it certainly wasn't hell. But they were in an existence, kind of I don't want to say suspended, but kind of waiting for Jesus's redemptive work. All right, we are. I'll stay and ask questions. I know we're out of time in terms of our in terms of online. For people who are online, again, and for everyone here, remember Palm Sunday next week, Easter Sunday, we will not have class, but we will reconvene once again at 10:30 on the Sunday after Easter. So thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.